Today we're going to look at the tongue, which is a part of the body that we use practically all day long, but which can be something of a mystery to us. Tucked away in our mouth as it is, it's difficult to really perceive what the tongue does and how it does it. So let's shed some light on this important muscular organ. The tongue is not just what we see when we look in our mouth. The root of the tongue connects to both the mandible, which is the jawbone, and the hyoid bone, which is the bone at the front of the larynx that is not connected to any other bone. That means most of the lower jaw is filled by the tongue. It also means that the tongue is very much intertwined with the larynx. Another thing to consider here is that the tongue is part of the pharynx. The pharynx, which is the passage from the back of the nose and mouth down the throat, is a tube made of muscles, and the tongue is one of those muscles. Earlier in this series, we looked at the idea of there being two modes of using the mouth and throat region: breathing and swallowing. We will examine in a bit more detail both of these with regard to the tongue. When you're swallowing food or liquid, your tongue will go to the roof of your mouth to shut off the oral cavity. This forces the food or liquid against the back of the throat, which will signal to the vagus nerve that you're going to swallow. The tongue filling the mouth is not just to force the food back, though. It also removes air from what you're about to swallow. We might imagine that it would be good to have air coming in behind the food, so that it can help force the food down the esophagus. But it really is a problem to swallow air. We don't want air mixed in with our food, so this function of the tongue is quite important. To swallow food, we don't want air pushing the food down. Instead, we essentially shorten the pharynx. The tongue and larynx go forward and up, and the esophagus opens. The food is then pushed that shortened distance. It goes through the sphincter at the top of the esophagus and into the digestive tract. Optimally, once the food is in the esophagus, the larynx and tongue go back and down, lengthening the pharynx again, and importantly, closing the esophagus. As I mentioned earlier, the tongue is connected to the hyoid bone, which is connected to the larynx. When the tongue goes up to the roof of the mouth, it will help pull the larynx and hyoid up as well. You can feel this movement if you simply put your hand on your larynx and swallow. You will feel the hyoid bone move forward and up. This is an indication that we don't want our tongue to be at the roof of our mouth at all times, because we don't want to be in swallowing mode all the time. As we saw a couple episodes back, we need to shut off our airway when swallowing, which is done by pulling the larynx forward and up and capping it with the epiglottis. Habitually lifting the tongue will restrict your airway and will harm your ability to speak and breathe. So now let's look at what we want for the tongue in breathing. F.M. Alexander often talked about allowing the tongue to lie flat in the mouth, but he wasn't talking about making the tongue inactive or relaxed. Our tongue is a very important part of how we speak, so it needs to be ready to move and needs to move efficiently when the time is right. If your tongue is at the roof of your mouth, you are not ready to speak. You're ready to swallow. Since we want the tongue to be able to act efficiently, we want to lengthen the muscles that make up the tongue. If we just pull the root of the tongue back and down, it's likely that we will pull the tip of the tongue back as well. If we want to lengthen the tongue, we can put the tip of our tongue against the back of the lower teeth, while we pull the root of the tongue back and down, which remember will also move the hyoid bone and larynx down. This will pull the tongue in two directions and lengthen it. We can also think about widening the tongue. If we pull the sides of the tongue up, we can depress the middle of the tongue and widen the tongue across the mouth. Trying this can help you realize what habits you have with your tongue. You may find that rather than keeping your tongue lengthened and widened, you habitually narrow your tongue and pull the tip back. As you work with your tongue, remember to keep the condition of your torso in mind. What's happening with the tongue is part of what is happening to the torso and the rest of the body. The habitual pulling back of the upper torso and head will be tied up with the movements you're habitually applying to your tongue. When we zoom in on a specific part of the body like this, we always need to remember that our goal is to coordinate the specific movements of the part with the general movements of the torso and the rest of the body. We can narrow our view to get acquainted with a certain area, but postural problems are all connected in a web, and often focusing in on one problematic area will not solve that problem, because the source of the problem is not in the specific area, but in the general coordination. So to wrap things up here, we generally want to keep the tongue low and flat in the mouth with the palate high. If the larynx is kept low, the tongue will be lengthened and widened in this configuration. We'll look at how to best keep the palate high in a future episode, but in the next episode, we'll look at the jaw. F.M. Alexander writes multiple times in his first book that a common problem people have with their jaw is that they pull their head back to open their mouth, essentially trying to raise the upper jaw. But if you examine the bones, it's clear that the lower jaw is the movable jaw. Alexander recommends we learn how to open our mouth by lowering the mandible and without throwing our head back. But there is another problem in opening the jaw. If we simply imagine the joint of the mandible as a hinge joint, then it seems that opening the jaw must cause the jaw to come back towards the throat. But that will crowd the larynx and is not something we want to do. Is there a way around this problem? Give it some thought and then join me next episode, and we'll start to work with the jaw.